History in its most traditional sense is often measured by the sharpness of a sword, the height of a castle wall, or the thunder of a cannon volley. We are taught to look for strength in the posture of a conqueror, a figure like Alexander the Great or Napoleon sitting tall upon a rearing stallion pointing destiny toward the horizon. But today I ask you to look away from the battlefield and stare directly into a very different kind of face. Look closely at the portrait on your screen. Observe the elongated skull, the heavy-lidded eyes that seem permanently exhausted by the burden of existence. Notice the lower lip, thick and pendulous, drooping as if gravity itself has a personal vendetta against it. And above all, witness the jaw, that jutting, defiant, and mathematically impossible. Lower jaw that protrudes so far forward it refuses to meet the upper row of teeth. This is not the face of a beggar nor a village idiot painted for amusement. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the face of God's anointed representative on earth. This is the face of the House of Habsburg. For 6 centuries, this dynasty did not just rule Europe, they owned it. From the misty Alps of Austria to the sun-drenched coasts of Spain and across the terrifying vastness of the Atlantic to the New World, their banner of black and gold cast a shadow that the sun literally could not escape. They were the architects of the modern world, the defenders of the Catholic faith, and the wealthiest landlords in human history. Yet there is a profound and dark irony etched into their very DNA in their desperate, almost fanatical quest to keep their blue blood pure, to ensure that their power was never diluted by the commonality of outsiders. They turned their family tree into a wreath, a perfect suffocating circle. They married their nieces, their cousins, and their uncles with such relentless frequency that they engaged in a war against biology itself, and biology, as it always does, fought back with a ruthless sense of humor. The Habsburgs spent centuries accumulating crowns, only to end up with heads too misshapen to wear them. They acquired every title imaginable, yet produced kings who could not speak, could not chew, and could not chew, and could not stand. Today, we peel back the velvet curtains of the greatest political soap opera ever told. This is not just a story of politic, but is a clinical case study of what happens when a family tries to play God with genetics. Welcome to the Chronicle of the Habsburgs, the dynasty that married the world and the curse of the jaw that devoured them from within. If you were to look at a map of Europe in the 13th century, it resembled a broken stained glass window. Hundreds of tiny squabbling duchies and bishoprics glued together by nothing but mud and bad intentions. But fast forward a few centuries and watch what happens. A stain begins to spread. It starts in the alpine valleys of Austria, bleeds into the rich trading ports of the Netherlands, floods across the Pyrenees into Spain, and then defying the ocean itself, spills over into the Americas and the Philippines. By the mid-6th century, the Habsburg domains were so vast that Charles V could rightfully claim the title that the British would later steal for themselves, the empire on which the sun never sets. It was a geopolitical monopoly, so absolute that you could walk from Vienna to Peru without ever leaving Habsburg soil. But here is the fascinating twist. They didn't paint the map using blood, at least not primarily. While the Mongols built an empire on piles of skulls, and the Romans paved theirs with the stones of crushed rebellions, the Habsburgs conquered the world with something far softer. Silk sheets and wedding rings. Their strategy was immortalized in a famous Latin couplet, Bella gerent ali to Felix Austria nuba. Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? Happy Austria. But let's be clear, this wasn't romance. It was corporate acquisition. The Habsburgs were the original venture capitalists of the Middle Ages. Why waste gold on mercenaries and risk getting stabbed in a muddy field when you can simply sign a marriage contract? Turned their daughters into diplomatic ballistic missiles and their sons into living treaties. They didn't need to besiege a kingdom if they could just impregnate the heir to its throne. It was a strategy of genius efficiency. But as any economist will tell you, when a monopoly grows too large, it stifles competition. And when you treat marriage purely as a merger, an acquisition strategy, completely ignoring the biological diversity required for human survival, you are planting a ticking time bomb in your own nursery. This series will take you on a journey that spans nearly 7 centuries. We will start in the modest rocky outcrops of Switzerland, where a virtually unknown count named Rudolf pulled off the greatest con in medieval history to snatch the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. We will witness the dizzying heights of the Renaissance under Charles V, a man who collapsed under the sheer weight of owning too much of the planet. We will then descend into the Gothic horror of the Spanish branch, dissecting the clinical nightmare of Philip II and his descendants, where the family tree twisted into a wreath of madness, culminating in a king whose internal organs dissolved before he even died. We will see the resilience of Maria Theresa, the ultimate tiger mom of Europe, and finally we will waltz into the twilight of Vienna with Franz J. Joseph, the old emperor who lived long enough to see everything he loved, and the world he understood, shattered by a single bullet in Sarajevo. This is not just a history of kings and queens, it is a cautionary tale about the obsession with purity. The Habsburgs believed their blood was sacred, a divine ichor that could not be mixed with the dirty water of lesser mortals. They locked the doors to their lineage, believing they were keeping the treasures in. They didn't realize they were locking the oxygen out, from a Swiss castle to a global superpower, and finally to a biological dead end. This is the story of how the Habsburgs won the Game of Thrones only to lose the game of life. To understand how a family of minor Swiss nobodies became the masters of the universe, we must first look at the mess that was 13th century Central Europe. If you think modern politics is dysfunctional, let me introduce you to the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1250. It was a political entity that famously prompted Voltaire to quip that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. In reality, it was a geopolitical mosh pit. For nearly 20 years, this massive chunk of land covering modern-day Germany, Austria, Czechia, and northern Italy had been suffering through a period known by historians as the Great Interregnum. It sounds like a majestic term, perhaps a time for deep philosophical reflection. It wasn't. It was anarchy with a fancy name. The old ruling dynasty, the Hohenstauffens, had died out, leaving the throne empty. And in the Middle Ages, an empty throne is like an unlocked bank vault in the middle of a riot. This was the era of Fustra, literally translated as fist law. Might makes right. Robber knights roamed the countryside, turning toll booths into extortion rackets. Castles sprouted up on every hilltop like poisonous mushrooms, each one inhabited by a petty lord who claimed to be the law. Commerce had ground to a halt because a merchant couldn't travel 5 miles without being shaken down by 3 different dukes and a bishop. The empire wasn't a state, it was 1,000 tiny kingdoms in a trench coat, all stabbing each other. Presiding over this dumpster fire were the 7 prince-electors. These were the 7 most powerful men in Germany. 3 archbishops and 4 secular princes who held the golden ticket, the right to vote for the next emperor. Now you might assume that, in a time of crisis, these men would look for a savior, a Charlemagne reborn, a strong man to restore order, crush the bandits, and unify the lands. You would be wrong. The last thing these electors wanted was a strong emperor. They had spent the last 2 decades enjoying the chaos. Chaos meant no taxes. Chaos meant they could steal land from their neighbors without consequences. They didn't want a lion who would bite them. They wanted a sheep they could shear. They needed a candidate with a noble title to satisfy the legal requirements, but one who was so poor, so militarily insignificant, and so politically isolated that he would function as nothing more than a rubber stamp in a crown. They needed a puppet, and in 1273, after scanning the bottom of the barrel, their eyes landed on a 55-year-old count from the backwaters of Switzerland. So, who was this man that the princes dragged out of obscurity to wear the crown of Charlemagne? Meet Rudolf von Habsburg. If you were to spot him in a medieval crowd, You wouldn't tremble in fear. You would probably just step aside to avoid being poked by his nose. Historical accounts describe him as uncommonly tall, lanky and bald, with a prominent aquiline nose that would become the trademark of his lineage long before the jaw took over. In 1273, Rudolf was already 55 years old. In the Bruta, laughed mathematics of the Middle Ages, where a tooth infection or a drafty window could kill you at 30, Rudolf was practically a walking fossil. He was a man of the past, not the future. Or so they thought. His resume was underwhelming. He was the Count of Habsburg, a title named after Habsburg or Hawk's Castle, a modest fortress perched on a rocky hill in what is now Switzerland. At that time, Switzerland wasn't the land of secret bank accounts and luxury watches. It was a rugged frontier of rocks, goats, and stubborn peasants. To the wealthy electors of the empire, men who owned cities, cathedrals, and private armies, Rudolf was a nobody. He was the safe choice, the political equivalent of beige wallpaper. They believed that a man with such shallow pockets and such a small army would be easy to control. They looked at him and saw a desperate old man who would be grateful just to sit at the big table. They assumed he would spend his twilight years signing their decrees and staying out of their way, but Rudolf had a superpower that the electors failed to account for. He was a survivor. You don't live to be 55 in the cutthroat world of feudal politics by being an idiot. While he lacked gold, he possessed a terrifyingly high political IQ. He was charming, pious, and utterly ruthless when necessary. He understood that the crown wasn't a prize, it was a tool. To secure the votes, he didn't offer bribes of gold. He didn't have any. Instead, he offered something far more valuable, his DNA. Before the election was even finalized, he betrothed his beautiful daughters to the key electors. He literally turned the voters into his sons-in-law. By the time the electors realized they hadn't hired a puppet, but had instead installed a patriarch, it was too late. The second-rate count had just pulled off the greatest promotion in history. Every good story needs a villa. And Rudolf found the perfect one in King Otar II of Bohemia. If Rudolf was the scrappy startup founder working out of a garage, Otkar was the CEO of a monopoly who lit cigars with $100 bills. Known as the Golden King, Otar was everything Rudolf was not. Powerful, immensely wealthy, and incredibly arrogant, he ruled over a vast Slavic empire and possessed a wardrobe that cost more than Rudolf's entire life savings. When Rudolf was elected emperor, Ottokar didn't just refuse to kneel. He didn't even bother to ask fee to the coronation. To him, Rudolf was a little count, a temporary nuisance that could be swatted away like a fly on a banquet table. But arrogance is a dangerous blindfold. Rudolf, using his newfound imperial authority, invoked a legal technicality to demand that Otar return the duchies of Austria and Styria, claiming they were stolen imperial property. It was a bold shakedown. Otar laughed, but his laughter died in his throat when he saw Rudolf marching towards Vienna, not just with an army, but with a coalition of every minor noble. Ottokar had ever bullied. The stage was set for the battle on the Marchfeld in August 1278. One of the largest cavalry battles in medieval history. On paper, this was a suicide mission for Rudolf. Ottokar's knights were the tanks of their day, heavy-armored behemoths gleaming in gold and iron. Rudolf's forces were a ragtag mix of light cavalry and desperate men, but Rudolf knew something Ottokar didn't. Chivalry is for losers. Winners use ambushes. In the 13th century, hiding a reserve unit to attack the enemy from the side was considered unchivalrous, a dirty trick fit for bandits, not kings. Rudolf didn't care. He hid 60 knights behind a hill, instructing them to wait until the fighting was thickest. As the two armies smashed into each other under the sweltering August sun, the sound of metal was deafening. Ottokar's heavy cavalry began to push Rudolf's lines back. The Golden King smelled victory. But then Rudolf gave the signal. His hidden unit burst from the treen, slamming into the exposed flank of the Bohemian army. It wasn't a duel. It was a prison shank in the ribs. Panic spread like wildfire. The Golden King was pulled from his horse, stripped of his magnificent armor, and butchered in the mud by vengeful Austrian nobles who had old scores to settle. When the dust settled, Rudolf stood over the naked, mutilated body of his rival. He didn't just win the battle, he won the real estate. He took Austria and Syria for himself, planting the Habsburg flag in the soil that would become their home for the next 640 years. Rudolf I died in 1291, leaving behind a terrified German nobility. They thought they had elected a harmless old man. Instead, they had unleashed a parasite that had just swallowed the southeastern corner of the empire. But Rudolf left his descendants something far more valuable than the land itself. He left them a playbook. He taught them that while battles like Marchfeld were necessary, they were also risky, expensive, and messy. Why risk dying in the mud when you can achieve the same result in a cathedral? Before his death, Rudolf worked tirelessly to weave his family into the fabric of European royalty. He married his daughters off to the Dukes of Bavaria, Saxony, and Brandenburg. He didn't just build alliances, he built a biological surveillance network. Every child born from these unions carried a drop of Habsburg blood, a latent claim to a future throne. Rudolf proved that in the Game of Thrones, you don't need to be the strongest piece on the board. You just need to be the one holding the most strings. He transformed the Habsburgs from Swiss mountain folk into Austrian dukes, shifting their center of gravity from the Hawk's Nest to the Danube. The foundation was set. The startup had successfully IPO'd. Now it was time for his successors to scale the business model. And the business model was simple. If you can't beat them, join them. And if you join them, make sure you marry them, outlive them, and inherit everything they own. If Rudolfi was the scrappy entrepreneur who built a family business out of a garage in the Swiss Alps, his great-great-great-grandson Charles was the bewildered heir who inherited a multinational conglomerate too big to fail and too big to manage, but to understand how one shy, stammering boy ended up owning nearly half the known world by his teenage years. We must first look at the most successful and arguably the most cynical breeding program in the history of human civilization. It was a genetic gamble that would make a Las Vegas casino owner blush. The story of Charles's inheritance is not one of conquest. It is a story of funerals. It begins with a series of marriages, so strategic they felt less like romance and more like corporate mergers. On one side of the family tree, we had his paternal grandfather, Maximilian Wine of Austria. Max was a man with a nose for art and an even better nose for other people's money. He secured the immensely wealthy lands of Burgundy, modern-day Belgium, and the Netherlands, not by firing a cannon, but by walking down the aisle with Mary of Burgundy. On the other side we had the power couple of the century, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the monarchs who funded Columbus and drove the Moors out of Granada. They had united the fractured kingdoms of Castile and Aragon into a global superpower. These two massive dynasties, the Habsburgs and the Trastomares, decided to merge. They married their children to each other in a double wedding arrangement to seal an alliance against France. But then, death began to play its part with suspicious efficiency. An astonishing sequence of premature deaths struck the royal houses of Europe. The heir to the Spanish throne died young. His sister died in childbirth. Her child died shortly after. It was as if the Grim Reaper was on the Habsburg payroll, clearing the path to the throne with a scythe in one hand and a family tree in the other. Suddenly, all the lines of succession converged on the womb of one woman. Joanna of Castile, Charles's mother. History remembers her unkindly as Joanna the Mad Juana Loca, but her madness was the crucible in which Charles's empire was forged. After her husband Philip the Handsome, a man who loved himself almost as much as Joanna loved him, died suddenly, possibly from drinking cold water after tennis, or possibly from poison. Joanna completely unraveled. She refused to bury him. For months, She traveled across the Spanish countryside with his emboweled corpse in an open coffin, periodically opening it to kiss his decaying feet, terrifying the local peasantry and traumatizing her children. Because of her mental instability, she was deemed unfit to rule. She was locked away in a nunnery, erasing the last obstacle between her son and ultimate power. And so we arrive at Charles. Born in a drafty bathroom in Ghent in the year 1500, he was the ultimate trust fund baby of the Renaissance. By the time he was 19, his list of titles was so long it required a deep breath to read aloud. He was the King of Spain, the Archduke of Austria, the Lord of the Netherlands, the King of Naples, and the Emperor of the New World. He owned the silver mines of Poissy and the banking houses of Augsburg. He owned the spice routes of the East and the woolen mills of the North. But genetics is a transactional god. It demands a price for such gifts. The merging of these massive inbred family, trady, has resulted in a physical deformity that would haunt the dynasty for centuries. In Charles, the infamous Habsburg jaw, medically known as mandibular prognathism, made its celebrity debut. Let us not mince words about this condition. It was not merely a cosmetic flaw, it was a disability. His lower jaw protruded so aggressively forward that it completely misaligned with his upper skull. His teeth could not meet. He physically could not close his mouth. As a result, his mouth hung perpetually open, allowing flies to drift in during court proceedings, a humiliation that forced his advisors to constantly remind him to cover his lips. Speech was a struggle. He stammered and lisped, his tongue too large for the distorted cavern of his mouth. But the act of eating was the true horror. Charles preferred to dine alone behind locked doors, away from the prying eyes of court courtiers who might gossip. Because he could not chew, he had to cut his food into tiny manageable bits and swallow them whole like a serpent or a bird of prey. This led to chronic indigestion, terrible stomach cramps, and a lifetime of gastrointestinal misery. Imagine the irony. The man who sat at the head of the world's banquet table could barely digest a simple piece of bread. This was the man chosen by God to defend Christendom. A man who looked like a caricature, moved with the stiffness of an old man while still in his youth, and carried the weight of an empire on a frame that seemed constantly on the verge of collapsing under its own biological contradictions. If you have ever felt overwhelmed by your job, if you have ever felt like you were juggling flaming chainsaws while riding a unicycle on a tightrope, then you have a vague understanding of what it was like to be Charles Vibe. Being the Emperor of the World sounds like a magnificent title fit for a tombstone or a heavy metal album cover. Reality. It was a sentence to life, imprisonment in the saddle of a horse. Charles was the CEO of a conglomerate that was simultaneously on fire underwater and undergoing a hostile takeover. He didn't rule a nation, he ruled a patchwork quilt of jealous territories that had nothing in common except a shared hatred for paying taxes. And looking at the map of Europe in the 1520s, Charles realized he was trapped in a geopolitical cage match with three specific men. Historians call them his great rivals. Charles probably called them his migraines. Together, they formed an unholy trinity, designed by fate to break his sanity. Enemy number one, the narcissist next door, Francis I of France. To the west lay France, the only major power in Europe that Charles didn't own. Ruling it was Francis the Fat, a man who was everything Charles was not. Francis was tall, athletic, handsome, and possessed a nose that was majestic rather than deformed. He was the Renaissance Prince Aphrodite, a patron of Leonardo da Vinci, a lover of fine wines, and a man who treated war like a sport. Francis looked at the map and saw a nightmare. Habsburg, Spain to his south, Habsburg, Germany to his east, and the Habsburg Netherlands to his north. France was encircled by the Habsburg Jaw. Consumed by a claustrophobic paranoia, Francis spent his entire reign poking Charles with a sharp stick. The rivalry was intensely personal. They called each other brother in letters, but plotted each other's demise over breakfast. The climax of this bromance gone wrong was the Battle of Pavia in 1525. In a stroke of humiliating luck, Charles's army didn't just defeat the French, they captured Francis II himself. Imagine the scene. The King of France, trapped under his dead horse, surrendering his sword to Charles's generals. Charles held him prisoner in Madrid for a year, but instead of executing him, Charles, ever the chivalrous fool, released him after making him sign a treaty. The moment Francis crossed the border back into France, he wiped his signature off the paper, jumped on a horse, and immediately started a new war. Charles learned a hard lesson. Honor is a handicap when your opponent is a sociopath. Enemy number 2, the shadow in the east, Sulian the Magnificent. While Charles was busy playing cat and mouse with the French, a far darker storm was gathering in the east. Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, was not interested in treaties or chivalry. He was interested in world domination. The Ottoman war machine was the most terrifying force on the planet. Their elite troops, the Janissaries, marched to the sound of bone-chilling military bands that could be heard miles away. In 1526, they crushed the Kingdom of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in just 2 hours. The King of Hungary drowned in a creek while trying to run away, leaving a power vacuum that brought the Turks right to Charles's doorstep. By 1529, the green flags of Islam were fluttering within sight of the spires of Vienna. The siege of Vienna wasn't just a military operation, it was an existential crisis. For Charles, who viewed himself as God's appointed shield of Christendom, this was the apocalypse. He was fighting for the soul of Europe. Vienna was saved not by Charles's genius, but by the weather. An early winter turned the Austrian mud into a sticky trap that bogged down the Ottoman cannons. But the fear remained. The Turk was always there, lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder that Charles's empire was mortal. Enemy number 3, the heretic within, Martin Luther. But the cruelest cut came not from a rival king or a foreign sultan, but from a grumpy German monk with a hammer. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses to a church door. And the shock wave shattered the one thing that held Charles's empire together, the Catholic faith. Charles was a devout, almost fanatical Catholic. He believed his primary duty was to shepherd souls to heaven. Now half his German subjects were telling the Pope to go to hell. The confrontation came at the Diet of Worms in 1521. Picture the contrast. On a high throne sits Charles I, dressed in velvet and gold, the most powerful man on earth, surrounded by cardinals and princes. Standing before him is a solitary monk in a rough wool habit. Charles ordered Luther to recant. Luther, looking the emperor in the eye, famously refused. "Here I stand. I can do no other." In that moment, Charles's power evaporated. He could burn cities, he could capture kings, but he could not kill. An idea. The Protestant Reformation tore his empire apart from the inside out. He found himself in a tragic, impossible position, fighting the French for land, fighting the Ottomans for survival, and fighting his own people for their souls. He was the policeman of Europe, running from one crime scene to another, arriving only to find the building already in flames. If there is a single moment in the 16th century that illustrates the dark comedy of Habsburg power, it is the morning of May 6, 1527. To understand the sheer absurdity of this event, you must remember Charles Fee's job title. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. His job description was practically one sentence long: defend the Pope and the Catholic faith. That was it. That was the whole gig. But Charles had a problem. He was arguably the richest man in history, owning the gold of the Americas. Yet he was perpetually broke. In the 16th century, transferring wealth from a mine in Peru to a bank in Genoa, and then to a battlefield in Italy, took months, if not years. His armies were operating on IOUs, stationed in northern Italy, was Charles's MO. Sterifying unit, the Lands Connects. These were German mercenaries, fearsome men in slashed doublets and flamboyant feathers who wielded two-handed swords the size of small trees. But they had a secret. Many of them were early followers of Martin Luther. To them, the Pope in Rome wasn't the Vicar of Christ. He was the PT of Babylon, the Antichrist, sitting on a throne of lies, and they hadn't been paid in months. They were hungry, they were angry, and they were armed to the teeth. When the money didn't arrive, the army mutinied, but they didn't just sit down. They marched south. They decided that if the emperor wouldn't pay them, they would extract their payment from the richest city on earth, Rome. What happened next was the death of the High Renaissance. On a foggy morning, the imperial troops breached the ancient Austrian walls. The defenders of Rome were swept aside like leaves in a hurricane. The only thing standing between the bloodthirsty mob and Pope Clement VII was the Swiss Guard. In a display of suicidal bravery, 189 Swiss Guards held the steps of St. Peter's Basilica against thousands of attackers. They were slaughtered almost to the last man. While his bodyguards were being hacked to pieces, Pope Clement VII did something very ungodlike. He hiked up his heavy silk robes and sprinted. He ran down the Pitio di Borgo, a secret, elevated corridor linking the Vatican to the fortified Castel Sant'Angelo. It is said that the white of his robes made him such an easy target that his aides had to throw a dark cloak over him to stop imperial musketeers from using him for target practice. For the next 8 months, Rome was turned into a vision of hell. The defender of the faith's own army desecrated the holiest sites in Christendom. Lutheran soldiers stabled their horses inside the sign-in chapel, letting animals defecate on the same floors where popes were. Elected, they used the tips of their pikes to scratch Lutheran graffiti into the priceless frescoes of Raphael, literally carving their hatred into the art history of the world. Nuns were auctioned off in the streets like cattle. Priests were tortured to reveal hidden gold. Charles V, sitting in Spain, was reportedly devastated when he heard the news. He stopped the festivities for the birth of his son and wore mourning black. But let's look closer at the politics. Was he horrified? Yes. Did he rush to free the Pope? No. He left the Pope locked in that castle for months. Charles realized a brutal truth. A free Pope is a nuisance. A captive Pope is a rubber stamp. The sack of Rome marked the moment the balance of power shifted forever. The Church was no longer an equal partner to the state. It was a hostage. Charles V had effectively put a gun to the head of God's representative and asked, "Now about that territory in Italy." By the year 1555, the master of the world was broken. Charles V was only 55 years old, but in the harsh currency of 16th-century kingship, he was a walking ruin. His famous jaw now caused him constant agonizing pain. His gout was so severe that he could no longer ride a horse, the very symbol of nobility, and had to be carried around in a sedan chair like an invalid. He had spent 40 years in the saddle. Fighting wars he didn't start, defending a church that was crumbling and managing a family that was inbreeding itself into disaster. He was the CEO of Europe, and he was suffering from the most spectacular case of burnout in history. So on October 25th, 1555, in the magnificent hall of the Golden Fleece in Brussels, Charles did the unthinkable. In a world where kings clung to power until their cold, dead fingers were pried off the scepter, Charles quit. The scene was pure theatre. Dressed in mourning black, weeping openly. The emperor leaned heavily on the shoulder of a handsome young nobleman named William of Orange. History, as always, loves a good joke. The man supporting the sobbing emperor would within a decade become the arch-nemesis of Charles's son and the destroyer of Spanish power in the Netherlands. In this tearful ceremony, Charles took a meat cleaver to the map of the world. He realized that his empire was a monster too large for any single human to feed, so he sliced it in two. To his brother Ferdinand, he gave the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian lands. To his son Philip, he gave Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, and the Americas. It was a decision of logistical genius and genetic suicide. By splitting the family into two distinct branches, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs, he ensured they would spend the next century desperately intermarrying to keep the inheritance together, creating a biological spiral that would end in horror. Charles then did something even stranger. He retired. He didn't just move to a summer palace. He retreated to the remote monastery of Yuste in the rugged hills of Extremadura, Spain. But don't imagine a humble monk's life. Charles moved in with a retinue of 50 servants, tapestries, velvet furniture, and his favorite paintings by Titian. In his retirement, the man who had tried to synchronize the politics of Europe became obsessed with synchronizing clocks. He filled his chambers with hundreds of intricate mechanical timepieces. He spent his days tinkering with gears and springs, frantically trying to make them all chime at the exact same second. He never succeeded. One was always too fast, another was always too slow. It is said that in a moment of bitter clarity he turned to his assistant and remarked to think that I attempted to force the reason and conscience of thousands of men into one mold, and I cannot in make two clocks agree. As his health failed, his eccentricity curdled into morbidity. In August 1558, Charles ordered the monks to hold a funeral for him. He was still alive. He lay in a coffin in the center of the church, wrapped in a burial shroud, eyes closed, breathing the scent of incense and burning wax, while the monks chanted the mass for the dead around him. He wanted to savor the grief of others. He wanted to audit his own legacy. 2 weeks later, on September 21st, 1558, the rehearsal became the real show. A simple mosquito carrying malaria slipped past the imperial guards and did what the French army and the Ottoman Turks never could. It killed the emperor. Charles V died, clutching a simple wooden cross, leaving behind a divided continent and a son, Philip II, who was about to inherit the most powerful empire on earth, along with a family tree that was slowly rotting from the roots up. If Charles V was the exhausted CEO who quit before the company crashed, his son Philip was the obsessive micromanager who tried to save it by reading every single email in the spam folder. When Philip ascended the throne in 1556, he inherited the fun half of the empire. He got Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the crown jewel, the Americas. This was the dawn of the Siglo de Oro, the Spanish Golden Age. To the outside observer, Spain looked like the lottery winner of geopolitics. Every year, the Flota de Indias treasure fleet docked in Seville, its hulls groaning under the weight of silver from the Potosi mines in modern-day Bolivia. Potosi was known as the mountain that eats men, a place where indigenous slaves died by the thousands to dig out the shiny metal that fueled Europe's economy. Spain was awash in cash. They had so much silver that they could pave the streets with it. But here lies the first great lesson of Habsburg economics. Money is not wealth. Spain became the victim of the Midas curse. Because they had so much silver, the value of silver plummeted, and the price of everything else, bread, cloth, weapons, skyrocketed. This was hyperinflation before economists even had a word for it. A loaf of bread in Madrid cost a fortune. And where did all this silver go? It didn't stay in Spain. It flowed right out of the country to pay for German muskets, Italian armor, and Dutch grain. Spain wasn't a bank. It was a funnel. They were merely the middlemen who transported silver from the mines of Peru to the pockets of bankers in Genoa and Augsburg. Philip II, the richest man in the world, declared state bankruptcy, defaulting on his loans not once, not twice, but 4 times during his reign. Imagine Jeff Bezos's credit card getting declined at a grocery store. That was the reality of the Spanish crown. And the man at the helm, Philip II, was a ghost. Unlike his father who lived in the saddle, Philip lived in a chair. He hated travel. He hated crowds. He built himself a headquarters that perfectly reflected his personality. El Escorial. It wasn't a palace like Versailles. It was a gigantic granite Moslem monastery located on a windswept hill outside Madrid. It was cold, severe, and intimidating. From a tiny undecorated office inside this stone tomb, Philip tried to run the world with a pen. He was the paper king. He insisted on reading every dispatch, every report, every minor grievance from every corner of his empire personally. He would spend hours correcting the spelling mistakes of his generals while his armies were starving in the field. He was the spider of the Escorial, sitting at the center of a global web, paralyzed by his own need for control. He once famously said, "Time and I are a match for any two other men." He was wrong. Time was his enemy. By the time he made a décision on to move a fleet, the season had changed. The crops had rotted, or the wind had died. His reign climaxed in the ultimate disaster of micromanagement, the Spanish Armada of 1588. Philip spent years building the invincible fleet to crush Protestant England. He calculated every biscuit, every barrel of gunpowder, every prayer, but he couldn't calculate the weather. When the Armada sailed, it was battered by storms and outmaneuvered by the smaller, faster English ships. The Protestant wind, as Queen Elizabeth called it, scattered the wreckage of the Spanish navy across the rocky coasts of Ireland. Philip took the news with his trademark stony stoicism, simply remarking, "I sent my ships to fight against men, not against the elements." But the world saw the truth. The giant was bleeding. The golden age was just a layer of gold leaf over a rotting piece of wood. If the political decline of Spain was a tragedy, the biological decline of the Habsburg family was a horror movie directed by Mother Nature. To understand why the most powerful dynasty on earth voluntarily destroyed itself, we must look at a map. The Habsburgs were terrified. They saw enemies everywhere. France, the Ottomans, the Protestants. They believed that the only people they could trust were their own kin. They adopted a policy of dynastic endogamy. In plain English, they stopped marrying strangers. They treated their bloodline like a bank vault. If a Habsburg princess married a French king, she might take a piece of the inheritance with her. To keep the land, the gold and the titles in the family, they decided to keep the DNA in the family too. They locked the door from the inside and threw away the key. And this brings us to the avunculate marriage, the uncle marrying his niece. This became the Habsburg signature move. It happened so often that the family tree stopped looking like a tree and started looking like a tangled fishing net, or perhaps a wreath. Philip the Tentbird married his niece. His son, Philip III, married his cousin. His son, Philip III, married his niece. Let's talk about the math of incest. Geneticists use a number called the inbreeding coefficient, or F, to measure how screwed up a genome is. If you marry a random stranger, the F is near 0. If you marry your first cousin, the F is 0.0625. If a brother and sister have a child, the F is 0.25. The final Habsburg king, Charles II, had an F of 0.25. P4, let that sink in. He was not the product of a brother and sister. But because his ancestors had been marrying their uncles and cousins for 200 years, his genetic code was more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. The cumulative damage was catastrophic. We can see the decay happening in real time through the portraits of the court painters. Look at Philip III. He was a man of startling mediocrity. Known as Philip the Pious, he spent more time praying than ruling. His jaw was prominent, his constitution weak. He lacked the energy to govern, handing the keys of the empire to corrupt favorites while he hunted and attended mass. Then came his son, Philip IV. History remembers him kindly because he was the patron of the great painter Diego Velázquez. But look closely at Velázquez's masterpieces. He paints Philip with a brutal honesty veiled in shadow. The king's face is long, mournful, almost melting. The jaw is heavier now, the lip more pronounced. Philip IV was known as the Planet King, yet during his reign the Spanish Empire began to lose its gravity, shedding territories like dead skin. Portugal broke away. The Netherlands became independent. But the true horror wasn't in the throne room. It was in the nursery. The Habsburgs were experiencing a massacre of the innocents. In 17th-century Spanish villages, the infant mortality rate was about 20% in the royal palaces, with the best doctors and the most food. The infant mortality rate was 50%. Half of the Habsburg children died before the age of 10. They died of simple fevers, digestive failures, and seizures. Their immune systems were practically non-existent. Philip IV fathered at least 13 legitimate children. Only 2 survived to adulthood. One was a daughter, Maria Theresa, who married Louis XIV of France, and the other was a sickly, trembling boy named Charles. The king watched his children die, one by one, a slow-motion punishment for the sins of his ancestors. He wrote in his letters of a deep melancholia that consumed him. He didn't know about genes or chromosomes. He only knew that God seemed to be taking his children back as fast as he could make them. The dynasty was not being defeated by cannons. It was being defeated by the silence of empty cradles. And so we arrive at the final act of this tragedy. The year is 1661. Spain, desperate for a male heir to continue the line, held its breath as Queen Mariana gave birth. The church bells rang, the cannons fired, and the people cheered. A son was born, the dynasty was saved. But inside the royal chamber, the mood was not one of celebration, but of horror. The child in the cradle was not a savior. He was a biological crime scene. This was Charles II, Carlos II, the man who would become known to history as El Hizardo, the bewitched. Charles was the end of the road. He was the final product of 2 centuries of cousins marrying cousins and uncles marrying nieces. If the Habsburg bloodline was a photocopier, Charles was the copy made after the machine had run out of toner and jammed 1,000 times. He was born with a head that was too large for his body, covered in crusty sores. His bones were so soft and brittle that he couldn't support his own weight. He did learn to speak until he was 4, and even then, few could understand him. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8. For most of his childhood, he was carried around like a porcelain doll that everyone was terrified of breaking. But the most striking feature, the family trademark, was the jaw. In Charles, the Habsburg jaw reached its grotesque evolutionary peak. His lower jaw jutted out so far that it didn't just misalign with the upper jaw. It lived in a different time zone. His 2 rows of teeth could not make contact. This meant that the king of the Spanish Empire physically could not chew. He had to be fed soft foods or swallow chunks of meat whole, leading to constant indigestion and vomiting. His tongue was abnormally large, filling his mouth so completely that his speech was a garbled, wet mumble. When he spoke, he drooled uncontrollably. In the 17th century, people didn't understand genetics. They didn't know about recessive traits or chromosomal defects. When they looked at their king, a man who suffered from hallucinations, seizures, and a body that seemed to be rebelling against itself, they had only one explanation: witchcraft. They believed Charles was the victim of a curse, a dark spell cast by the enemies of Spain. And so, the cure for his condition wasn't medicine. It was exorcism. Imagine the life of this poor man. He was surrounded by priests who doused him in holy water, pressed crucifixes against his twisted limbs, and forced him to drink concoctions made of dried vipers and pulverized human skulls. He was dragged into churches to touch the corpses of saints, hoping that the holiness of the dead would fix the brokenness of the living. Charles II was not a villain. He was the ultimate victim. He was a man bred for power but built for suffering. He possessed a dim, tragic awareness of his own inadequacy. He knew he was like other men. He knew his wife was terrified of him. He knew his court was mocking him. Yet, in a display of sheer biological stubbornness, he refused to die. The courts of Europe spent 30 years betting on his death, dividing up his empire on paper while he was still breathing. But Charles clung to life with a desperate, clawing tenacity, surviving smallpox, measles, and the incompetence of his own doctors. He was a king who lived his entire life in a state of dying. On November 1st, 1700, the inevitable finally happened. Charles II, the King of Spain and the Indies, took his final labored breath at the age of 38. The bewitched king was dead. The dynasty that had conquered half the planet had finally run out of luck. And more importantly, it had run out of viable DNA. But the true horror of the Spanish Habsburgs wasn't revealed until the next morning, when the royal physicians performed the autopsy. What they found inside the king's body was so grotesque, so medically baffling, that the report reads less like a scientific document and more like a passage from a Gothic horror novel. The physician, Dr. Antonio Pedro Gacciatorina, wrote, "The corpse did not contain a single drop of blood. The heart was the size of a peppercorn, the lungs corroded, the intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. Let's analyze that for a moment. A heart the size of a peppercorn. It is a metaphor for the dynasty itself, shriveled, atrophied, and utterly spent. The Spanish Habsburgs had spent 2 centuries trying to preserve their blue blood, to keep it pure and unmixed. And in the end, the autopsy claimed there was no blood left at all. They had purified themselves into oblivion. With Charles's death, the Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg went extinct. There was no heir. The throne of the world's largest empire was empty. The result was exactly what Charles V had feared a century earlier: chaos. The vultures of Europe, France, Britain, Austria immediately descended upon the carcass of the Spanish Empire, launching the War of the Spanish Succession. It was a global conflict that would tear Europe apart for 13 years. The Spanish Habsburgs didn't fall because of a revolution. They didn't fall because of an invasion. They fell because they loved themselves too much. They believed that their blood was a divine substance that could not be shared with the common world. History proved them wrong. Biology demands diversity. By closing the circle, they suffocated the flame. The sun finally set on the Spanish Empire, not in a blaze of glory, but in a cold, silent room with a king whose heart was too small to keep beating. While the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs was busy rotting away in Madrid, the Austrian branch in Vienna was facing a different kind of crisis. It was not a crisis of too much inbreeding, but rather a crisis of chromosomes. For centuries, the Habsburgs had relied on a steady production of male heirs to keep the machine running. But in the early 18th century, the biology gods decided to play a cruel trick on Emperor Charles II of Sexix. They gave him daughters. Charles' sex was a man consumed by anxiety. He looked at his family tree and saw a dead end. He knew that according to the ancient Salic law, women were forbidden from inheriting the crown. If he died without a son, the Austrian Empire would be chopped up and fed to the wolves of Europe. So Charles spent the last 20 years of his life doing something rather pathetic. He didn't build armies, he built a piece of paper. He drafted a document known as the Pragmatic Sanction. This was essentially a desperate legal contract in which he begged, bribed, and cajoled the other kings of Europe, hoped to promise that they would allow his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, to inherit the throne unharmed. Charles traveled across the continent, handing out bags of gold and trading territories, asking powerful monarchs to sign his piece of paper, and to their credit, they all signed it. They drank his wine, took his gold, and swore on the Bible that they would respect his daughter's rights. Charles IC went to his grave in 1740, believing he had secured his legacy. He was a fool. The moment the breath left the old emperor's body, the gentlemen of Europe proved that sexism was a far stronger force than honor. The ink on the Pragmatic Sanction was barely dry when Frederick II of Prussia, a young king who would later be known as Frederick the Great, made his move. He didn't send a condolence letter. He sent an invasion force. Frederick famously remarked that contracts without swords are but paper, and he proceeded to march his troops into the wealthy Habsburg province of Silesia. He looked at the 23-year-old Maria Theresa and saw a victim. He assumed she would faint at the sight of a musket. He assumed she would surrender to save her skin. He assumed that because she was a woman, she was weak. It was an assumption that Frederick and the rest of Europe would spend the next 40 years regretting. The year 1740 was not just a bad year for the Habsburgs. It was an existential nightmare. Maria Theresa found herself standing in the wreckage of a bankrupted state. Her army was a museum exhibit of starving soldiers and senile generals who were more concerned with their gout medication than with military strategy. Her treasury contained nothing but cobwebs and IUS. And across the border, Frederick the Great of Prussia was already sharpening his carving knife, having just snatched the wealthy province of Silesia like a thief in the night. The experts of Europe placed their bets. The odds were 100 to 1. That the Habsburg Empire would collapse within 6 months. They expected Maria Theresa to panic, to flee, or perhaps to faint in a delicate ladylike fashion. Instead, she did something that terrified them. She went to work. Her first masterstroke was the Hungarian gambit we witnessed, where she turned potential rebels into fanatical defenders with a single speech and a crying baby. But speeches don't buy gunpowder. To win the war of the Austrian succession, Maria Theresa needed cash, and she needed it from the only people who had it, the nobility and the clergy. For centuries, these two groups had enjoyed a tax-exempt status that was practically sacred. They owned the land, they owned the peasants, and they paid absolutely nothing. Maria Theresa looked at this ancient feudal contract and tore it up. With a polite but iron smile, she informed the dukes and the bishops that the party was over. She forced them to pay taxes. It was a domestic revolution. When they complained, she simply pointed to the Prussian cannons aimed at Vienna and asked if they would prefer to explain their tax-exempt status to King Frederick. They paid up. For the first time in history, the Austrian state had a steady income that didn't depend on the charity of the Pope or the loans of English bankers. With this money, she rebuilt the army from the ground up. She fired the old generals, men who owed their rank to their last name rather than their talent, and promoted young, hungry officers like Dorn and Lorden based on merit. She founded the Theresa Military Academy, declaring that she didn't want aristocrats on horses. She wanted professional killers in uniform. But Maria Theresa wasn't satisfied with just surviving the war. She wanted to control the peace. She realized that a chaotic empire of a dozen different languages and laws was impossible to govern. So she became the ultimate bureaucrat-in-chief. She centralized everything. Before her, if you wanted to send a letter from Innsbruck to Prague, it had to pass through 4 different legal systems. She smashed these local privileges, creating a unified Austrian state run from Vienna. She was the original micromanager, waking up at 5 a.m. every morning to read police reports and draft laws while her husband Francis Stephen slept. Speaking of her husband, Francis was a charming, easygoing man who was technically the Holy Roman Emperor, but everyone knew who wore the pants in the Schönbrunn Palace. While Maria Theresa ran the empire, Francis ran the businesses. He was actually a financial genius who turned the royal family's debts into a massive fortune by investing in denim factories and supplying uniforms to his wife's army. It was the perfect marriage. She had the power. He had the credit card. However, there was a darker, more satirical side to her mother of the country persona. Maria Theresa was a devout, almost fanatical Catholic, and she viewed her subjects not just as citizens, but as naughty children who needed to be disciplined. She established one of the most bizarre institutions in European history, the Koschheitskommission, or the Chastity Commission. This was a secret police force dedicated entirely to policing the bedroom activities of the Viennese people. Her agents, known as Commissioners of Chastity, roamed the streets, raiding brothel, checking the registration of actresses, and even bursting into private homes to ensure that men were sleeping with their own wives. If a man was caught with a mistress, he could be deported to the bandit-infested borders of the Balkans. It was a moral crusade that made Vienna the most paranoid, curtain-twitching city in Europe. The great Casanova himself had to flee the city to escape her moral dragnet, and to house this new centralized moralistic empire, she built the Schönbrunn Palace. It was her answer to Versailles, a massive yellow bar confection with 1,541 rooms. But unlike the French kings who built palaces to party, Maria Theresa built Schönbrunn to work. It was a factory of government filled with screaming children. She had 16 of them, remember, and scratching pens. By the end of the War of the Austrian Successio, in 1748, although she had lost Silesia to Prussia, she had achieved the impossible. She had saved the Habsburg monarchy from extinction. She had transformed a loose collection of feudalist states into a modern, centralized, militarized state. She looked at the map of Europe, bloodied but unbowed, and essentially said, "I am still here." The girl who wasn't supposed to rule had become the Iron Mother of Europe, and she was just getting started. If Frederick the Great fought his wars with iron and gunpowder, Maria Theresa fought hers with something far more renewable, biology. While she was busy reforming the tax code and rebuilding the army, she was also engaged in a feat of human endurance that baffles modern obstetricians. In the span of 19 years, she gave birth 16 times. Let us pause to appreciate the sheer physical logistics of this. For 2 decades, the Empress of Austria was essentially pregnant or recovering from childbirth while simultaneously running the largest empire in Central Europe. She would spend her mornings meeting with generals to discuss artillery movements and her afternoons in the labor ward, securing the succession. She turned her body into a factory of diplomacy. Maria Theresa loved her children. Of that, there is no doubt, but she loved the state more. In her eyes, her children were not merely human beings. They were strategic assets, high-value currency, to be spent in the marketplace of European power. She revived the ancient Habsburg motto, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria," marry, and applied it with the ruthlessness of a corporate merger specialist. She was the ultimate tiger mother long before the term existed. She educated her daughters not to be happy, but to be queens. She micromanaged their lives from thousands of miles away. Even after they were married off to foreign kings, they could not escape her gaze. She wrote them weekly letters that were less like correspondence and more like performance reviews. She criticized their posture, their dental hygiene, their prayer habits, and even their performance in the marital bed. She demanded weekly reports on their menstruation cycles, because a queen who wasn't ovulating was a queen who wasn't doing her job. The climax of this biological warfare came in 1756 with the diplomatic revolution. For 300 years, the Habsburgs of Austria and the Bourbons of France had been mortal enemies. They had killed each other in Italy, in Germany, and in the Americas. Hatred of the French was practically a requirement for Austrian citizenship. But Maria Theresa, guided by her brilliant and eccentric chancellor, Prince Kitz, looked at the map and realized the game had changed. The real threat was no longer France. It was the upstart Prussia. So she did the unthinkable. She flipped the table. She reached out to King Louis X-15 of France and proposed an alliance. It was the geopolitical equivalent of cats and dogs deciding to move in together. Europe was stunned. To seal this unholy alliance, Maria Theresa played her final and most tragic card, her youngest, prettiest, and most flighty daughter, Maria Antonia. We know her better as Marie Antoinette. The negotiations were brutal. Maria Theresa knew that the French court at Versailles was a snake pit of gossip and vice, a place that would chew up a naive Austrian girl. She knew her daughter was ill-equipped for the role. Maria Antonia was charming but scatterbrained, more interested in pugs and fashion than in politics. Yet the Empress did not hesitate. The alliance required a sacrifice. In April 1770, a tearful 14-year-old Marie Antoinette bid farewell to her mother at the Hofburg Palace. Maria Theresa embraced her daughter and gave her a final piece of chilling advice. Do so much, Would to the French people that they can say that I have sent them an angel. But privately she wrote to a friend knowing the truth. I have sacrificed her for the peace of Europe. As the carriage rattled away toward France, taking the girl to her doom, Maria Theresa didn't have time to grieve. She went back to her desk. She had 15 other children to manage, an empire to run, and a war to plan. She had successfully placed a Habsburg on the throne of Naples, one in Parma, one in Tuscany, and now one in Versailles. She was the grandmother of Europe, but it was a title bought with the happiness of her own flesh and blood. She had won the game of marriages, unaware that in France the game was about to change from poker to Russian roulette. By the 1770s, Vienna had transformed. Under Maria Theresa, the city ceased to be a mere military fortress against the Turks and blossomed into the cultural capital of the Western world. But it was a peculiar kind of paradise, a gilded cage where beauty served as a distraction from autocracy. This was the era when the Habsburg brand shifted forever. They realized they could no longer conquer Europe with armies, so they decided to conquer it with style. Vienna became the city of the waltz, the coffee house, and the pastry shop. It was a place where the air itself seemed composed of sugar and violin strings. The Empress understood the power of soft power. She poured money into the arts, turning her court into a magnet for geniuses. It was in her mirrored halls that a 6-year-old prodigy named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart climbed onto her lap, kissed her on the cheek, and promised to marry her daughter, Marie Antoinette, a sweet, innocent moment that history would later tint with tragic irony. It was here that Joseph Haydn, the father of the symphony, composed music that organized chaos into harmony, much like Maria Theresa tried to do with her empire. But let us not be seduced by the soundtrack. Behind the RCOO for cads in the symphonies lay a police state. Maria Theresa's Vienna was a city of spies. Her chastity commission was still prowling the streets, reading mail and deporting adulterers. She banned books by the Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau, calling them poison for the soul. She wanted her subjects to be cultured, yes, but not thinking. She wanted them to dance, not to debate. She created a society that was polite, artistic, and profoundly repressed, a trait that would define the Austrian character for the next 2 centuries. The final act of her life was painted in black. In 1765, her beloved husband, Francis Stephen, died of a stroke in his carriage. Maria Theresa was shattered. She had been the ruler, but he had been her anchor. In a gesture of supreme melodrama, she cut off her hair, gave away her jewelry, and draped her entire empire in mourning. She ordered the rooms of the Hofburg Palace to be upholstered in black velvet. For the next 15 years, she never wore another color. She became the Black Widow of Europe, a somber, imposing figure drifting through the corridors of Schönbrunn like a ghost of the past. Her relationship with her son and co-ruler Joseph II became a poisonous war of attrition. Joseph was a radical progressive who wanted to tear down the church and liberate the serfs. Maria Theresa was a conservative pragmatist who wanted to keep the world exactly as it was. They argued daily. She called him a reckless boy. He called her a superstitious old woman. In November 1780, the end finally came. Her body, worn out by 16 pregnancies and 40 years of stress, finally gave up. She suffered from edema, her legs so swollen she could no longer walk, her lungs filling with fluid on her deathbed. As she struggled to breathe, Joseph tried to make rock comfortable, saying, "Your Majesty, you are not comfortable like that." Maria Theresa, defying the universe to the very last second, gasped out her final words, "Yes, but I am comfortable enough to die." When she passed, she left behind a paradox. She had saved the Habsburg Empire from destruction, centralized its government, and given it a cultural identity that endures to this day. But she had also frozen it in time. She left a solid, magnificent structure, that was completely unequipped for the coming storm of the French Revolution. She had built a beautiful dam, unaware that the flood waters were already rising over the top. If Maria Theresa was the mother who tried to hold the family together with discipline, her great-great-grandson, Franz Joseph II, was the grandfather who refused to admit the house was burning down. We now fast forward through the Napoleonic Wars, where the Holy Roman Empire was finally put out of its misery and rebranded simply as the Austrian Empire to the year 1848. Historians call 1848 the springtime of nations. It sounds poetic, like a season of flowers. In reality, it was a season of Molotov cocktails. Across Europe, people were tired of kings, tired of taxes, and tired of being told what to do. The streets of Vienna, Prague, and Budapest were barricaded. The mob was at the gates. The Habsburg Dynasty was facing extinction. In a panic, the family looked at the current Emperor Ferdinand. Ferdinand was well. Let's just say the Habsburg inbreeding hadn't finished its work yet. He was hydrocephalic, epileptic, and famously simple-minded. When he saw the revolution from his palace window, he asked his chancellor, "Are they allowed to do that?" When told the people were revolting, his only concern was, "But do I still get my dumplings?" Clearly, Ferdinand had to go. In a quiet palace coup, the family forced him to abdicate and shove Dia's 18-year-old nephew onto the throne. Enter Franz Joseph. Imagine being 18 years old. You should be worrying about romance in university. Instead, Franz Joseph was handed a crumbling empire of 50 million people who hated each other, speaking a dozen different languages, all trying to kill him. He didn't just step onto a throne. He stepped onto a landmine to survive. Keep France. Joseph made a deal with the devil. In 1867, after a humiliating defeat by the Prussians, he was forced to sign the compromise. This turned the Austrian Empire into the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. It was a political Frankenstein. The country had 2 parliaments, 2 prime ministers, and a bureaucracy so complex it inspired the nightmares of Franz Kafka. They printed money in 10 languages. An army officer had to give commands in German, but his soldiers might only speak Hungarian, Croatian, or Czech. It was a Tower of Babel held together by a single man's whiskers, and that man was a dinosaur. Franz Joseph ruled for 68 years. He was the eternal emperor. As the world raced into the future, inventing the telephone, the automobile, the airplane, and electricity, Franz Joseph stayed perfectly still. He hated progress. He refused to use a telephone. He refused to use a typewriter. He refused to ride in a car, calling it a stinking mechanical cart. He viewed himself not as a glamorous conqueror, but as the first civil servant of the state. He woke up every single morning at 4 a.m., slept on a simple iron camped, and stood at a high desk, signing documents for 12 hours a day. He was trying to hold back the tide of history with paperwork. He was a tragic figure, a man diligently polishing the brass railings of the Titanic long after it had hit the iceberg. If Franz Joseph's political life was a struggle, his personal life was a Greek tragedy, written by a sadist. Seemed that for every year he stayed on the throne, fate demanded a blood sacrifice from his immediate family. He was the emperor, who possessed everything yet held nothing. The first blow struck in 1867. His younger brother, Maximian, was a romantic dreamer who lived in the shadow of the emperor. Bored and ambitious, Maximian accepted a job offer that was essentially a death sentence. The Emperor of Mexico. It was a puppet regime set up by the French, and it collapsed almost immediately. Maximilian was captured by Mexican Republicans. Franz Joseph pleaded for his brother's life, but the telegraph wires brought back only silence. On a dusty hill in Cheto, Maximilian stood before a firing squad. He handed a gold coin to each executioner, asking them not to shoot him in the face so his mother could recognize him in the coffin. They shot him in the heart. Franz Joseph received the news at his breakfast table and never spoke of it again. But the horror was just beginning. The emperor's only son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, was a man born in the wrong century. Rudolf was a liberal, an intellectual, and a writer who used a pseudonym to criticize his own father's government in the newspapers. He wanted to modernize the empire. Franz Joseph wanted to freeze it. The father and son were aliens to each other. Crushed by the weight of his father's disapproval and suffering from depression and morphine addiction, Rudolf saw no way out. On a freezing morning, in January 1889, in the royal hunting lodge at Beiling, servants broke down the door to find the prince dead. Beside him lay the body of his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzer. It was a murder-suicide pact. The emperor was so ashamed that he ordered a massive cover-up claiming Rudolf died of a heart attack, but the truth leaked out, shattering the myth of the perfect Habsburg family. Franz Joseph didn't just lose a son, he lost the future of his dynasty. Then there was his wife, the legendary Empress Elizabeth, known to the world as Sisi. She was the most beautiful woman in Europe, with floor-length chestnut hair and a waist that measured a terrifying 16 in. But she was also deeply unhappy. She suffocated under the rigid court protocol of Vienna and spent her life running away from her husband, traveling incessantly to Greece, Hungary, and England. She suffered from severe anorexia and depression, hiding her face behind a fan as she aged. On September 10, 1898, while Sisi was walking to a steamship in Geneva, Switzerland, a young Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini rushed at her. He didn't have a gun or a knife. He was too poor. He had a sharpened industrial file. He stabbed her once in the chest. Sisi didn't even realize she was dying. She boarded the boat, asked what happened to me, and then collapsed. The file had pierced her heart when the telegram reached Vienna. Franz Joseph was sitting at his desk, working as always. He read the words that his beloved angel was dead. He slumped forward and whispered a line that would become his epitaph. Mir bleibt's, I am spared nothing. He was spared nothing. He buried his brother, his son, and his wife. He was the loneliest man in the world, trapped in a palace filled with ghosts. Yet the next morning at 4 a.m., the lights in his office turned on. The emperor was back at his desk. The files needed to be signed. The empire had to continue, even if the man running it was already dead inside. With his son dead, Franz Joseph needed a new heir. Fate, in its infinite cruelty, pointed a finger at his nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. If Franz Joseph was a living statue of the past, Franz Ferdinand was a ticking time bomb of the future. The two men loathed each other. Franz Joseph was cold, disciplined, and hated change. Franz Ferdinand was short-tempered, reformist, and dangerously impatient. He had a radical plan. He wanted to turn the dual monarchy into a United States of Greater Austria, giving rights to the Slavs to stop them from revolting. To the old emperor, this was heresy. But the real source of their hatred was personal. Franz Ferdinand had committed the ultimate Habsburg sin. He married for love. He fell for a mere countess. She was nobility. Yes, but in the eyes of the Habsburg court, she was trash. She wasn't royal enough. Franz Joseph tried everything to stop the wedding. When he failed, he humiliated them. He forced Franz Ferdinand to sign an oath that his children would never inherit the throne. In court processions, Sophie was forced to walk behind the lowest archduchesses. At imperial dinners, she was seated far away from her husband. The emperor turned their love story into a daily public shaming. This toxic family drama set the stage for June 28, 1914. It was supposed to be a happy day. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie traveled to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, a province Austria had recently annexed. Why? Because it was their 14th wedding anniversary. It was the one day a year when, away from the stifling protocol of Vienna, France, Ferdinand could ride in a carriage beside his wife like a normal husband. He didn't go there to inspect the army. He went there to hold her hand, but security was a joke. The Archduke was warned that Sarajevo was a nest of Serbian terrorists who wanted to destroy the empire. He ignored them. On the morning of the visit, 7 assassins from the Black Hand group lined the Appel Key route. They were young, amateur-ish, and dying of tuberculosis. They had nothing to lose. The first assassin lost his nerve. The second threw a bomb, but it bounced off the folded roof of the Archduke's convertible and exploded under the car behind them. Most leaders would have fled the city immediately. Not Franz Ferdinand. Furious, he shouted at the mayor, "I come here as your guest, and you greet me with bombs." But then, in a decision that doomed the world, he insisted on visiting the injured officers in the hospital. The driver, confused by the change of plans, took a wrong turn onto Franz Josef Street. Realizing the mistake, he stopped the car to reverse. The gears jammed, the car stalled, and there, sitting at a cafe, eating a sandwich, or perhaps just loitering, as history debates the sandwich detail, was 19-year-old Gabriello Princip. He was one of the failed assassins, despondent that the plot had failed. He looked up and he couldn't believe his eyes. The target was sitting 5 feet away in a stored car like a duck in a shooting gallery. Prince stepped forward. He closed his eyes. He later admitted he turned his head away because he didn't want to see the Duchess and fired 2 shots. Bang! Bang! One bullet hit Franz Ferdinand in the jugular. The other hit Sophie in the stomach. As the Archduke slumped over, his only concern was his wife. His last words were not about the empire, but a plea to the woman he had fought the whole world to love. Sophie, don't die. Live for our children." Within minutes, they were both dead. The anniversary trip was over. Back in Vienna, when the 84-year-old Emperor Franz Joseph heard the news, he didn't weep. He didn't rage. He simply stared into the distance and uttered a sentence that chills the blood with its icy detachment. "A higher power has restored that order which I could not maintain." He meant that the problematic heir and his unsuitable wife were gone. The morganatic marriage issue was resolved. Even in the face of tragedy, the Habsburg obsession with protocol came first. He didn't know it yet, due to that restored order was about to cost the lives of 20 million people. The assassination gave the hawks in Vienna exactly what they wanted. An excuse. They didn't care about Franz Ferdinand. They were actually glad he was dead, but they cared about honor. They decided to punish Serbia. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the shooting, Franz Joseph sat at his desk. His hand trembled as he dipped his pen in the ink. He signed the declaration of war against Serbia. He thought it would be a small, punitive expedition, a quick slap on the wrist. He was wrong. The intricate web of alliances that Europe had spent decades building suddenly snapped tight. Russia mobilized to help Serbia. Germany mobilized to help Austria. France mobilized to help Russia. Britain mobilized to help Belgium. Within a week, the entire continent was on fire. The old emperor lived for 2 more years, watching the world burn from the windows of Schönbrunn. He saw the reports of millions dying in the trenches, the very catastrophe he had spent his life trying to avoid. He died on November 21, 1916, in the middle of the war, leaving the throne to his grandnephew Charles I. But the game was already over. 2 years later, in 1918, the war ended, and so did the world of the Habsburgs. The Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't just surrender, it evaporated. It dissolved into a dozen new nations: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland. On a cold November day, in 1918, the last Habsburg Emperor, Charles II, packed his bags. There was no bloodshed, no storming of the palace. He simply walked out the back door. The family that had ruled for 645 years, the family that had married the world, was homeless. The dynasty ended, not with a bang, but with a signature on a piece of paper, releasing their subjects from their oath of loyalty. The curse of the jaw, the curse of the blue blood, and the curse of ambition had finally run their course. The Habsburgs had tried to conquer time itself, And in the end, time won. When the guns of World War I finally fell silent in 1918, the House of Habsburg evaporated into the mist of history. But unlike other empires that vanished, leaving only ruins like the Mongols or the Romans, the Habsburgs left behind something far more haunting. They left behind a ghost that still walks the streets of Central Europe today. If you visit Vienna now, you are not visiting a modern metropolis. You are walking through the most beautiful graveyard in the world. The legacy of the Habsburgs is not military, it is atmospheric. They created a culture of joyful apocalypse. For centuries, the Viennese knew their empire was dying, so they decided to enjoy the funeral. This peculiar mindset gave birth to the famous Viennese coffeehouse culture. These were not just places to drink caffeine, they were incubators of genius born from stagnation. Because the Habsburg censors forbade people from debating politics, the intellectuals turned inward. They explored the only territory the emperor couldn't police, the human mind. It is no coincidence that Sigmund Freud invented psychoanalysis in Vienna at the height of Franz Joseph repression. The repression of the state directly fueled the exploration of the subconscious. The Habsburgs tried to control the body, so their subjects liberated the mind. Artistically, they left us the Baroque nightmare and the RCOO dream. They gave us the music that defines Western civilization. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Strauss. They were all servants in one way or another of this dynasty. The Habsburgs realized early on that if they couldn't be the strongest power, they would be the most cultured. They used symphonies like other kings, used artillery. The Blue Danube Waltz is not just a song. It is the heartbeat of an empire that refused to accept it was drowning. But look at the map of 2024. The political legacy is far more brutal. The fragmentation of Central Europe, the borders of Austria, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, and even parts of Ukraine and Romania is the shattered glass of the Habsburg window. The ethnic tensions that explode periodically in the Balkans are the direct inheritance of the Habsburg policy of divide and rule. They kept these nations in a state of suspended animation, forcing them to live together in a dysfunctional marriage for centuries. When the divorce finally came in 1918, it was violent, and the custody battle is in many ways still ongoing. The Habsburgs didn't solve the problem of nationalism. They merely froze it, and when the ice melted, the flood drowned the 20th century. If we step back from the specific tragedies of Charles II's jaw or Franz Joseph's loneliness, a larger, darker law of the universe emerges. The Habsburgs provide us with the ultimate case study in the danger of purity. Humans have an obsession with the concept of pure. We want pure gold, pure water, pure blood. But nature abhors purity. Nature demands chaos. Nature demands variety. In biology, a species that refuses to mix is a species that chooses to die. The Habsburgs tried to defy this law. They viewed their DNA as a divine substance, a sacred ichor that was too precious to be shared with the rest of humanity. They built high walls around their gene pool to keep the contaminants out, not realizing they were locking the toxins in. They wanted a family tree that grew straight up to heaven, but instead they created a wreath that strangled itself. The lesson is brutal, but simple. The purer the blood, the weaker the life. Power, like water, must flow to stay fresh. When it is stagnant, it turns into a swamp. And here lies the supreme irony of their existence. This was the dynasty that conquered the world, not by the sword, but by the wedding ring. Their motto was Happy Austria, marry. Yet in the end, it was marriage that killed them. The very tool they used to build their empire became the weapon that dismantled it. They didn't fall because of a stronger enemy. They fell because they loved themselves too much. It is the geopolitical equivalent of Narcissus staring into the pool until he drowned. This forces us to ask a difficult question about the human condition. Why do we crave forever? The Habsburgs, like the pharaohs before them and the tech billionaires of today, were obsessed with legacy. They wanted to freeze time. They wanted to ensure that their name, their face, and their power would endure for eternity. But is there any instinct more foolish than the desire for permanence in a universe built on change? The Habsburgs spent 600 years trying to stop the clock. They fought against the Reformation. They fought against the Enlightenment. They fought against democracy. And they fought against biology. They won many battles, but they lost the war against entropy. They teach us that the harder you grip power, the more it crushes the hand that holds it. They thought they were the architects of history, but in the end, they were merely its most expensive victims. And so we leave the fading echoes of the Viennese waltz behind. The Habsburgs have left the building, taking their peculiar chins and their rigid protocols with them. But as the sun sets on the Danube, it rises in the west with a blinding, terrifying brilliance. If the Habsburgs taught us that trying to preserve power through marriage is a slow suicide, our next dynasty will teach us a different lesson. The danger of believing you are God. In the next episode of Legacy of Thrones, we travel to Fear, Ants. We are going to meet the House of Bourbon. We will trade the gloomy crypts of Vienna for the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. We will meet the man who wore high heels, invented fashion, and declared, "I am the state." Louis Thacid, 14, the Sun King. But be warned, this is a story of excess, on a scale you cannot imagine. It is a party that lasted for 2 centuries, fueled by champagne, scandal, and the blood of the starving peasantry. And unlike the Habsburgs, who faded away in silence, the party of the Bourbons ends with a crash. It ends with the invention designed by a doctor, a heavy blade falling at gravity speed, and a basket waiting to catch the anointed heads of kings. From the Sun King's golden bed to Marie Antoinette's bad hair, day on the scaffold, the Bourbons are waiting to show you the true cost of luxury. I am Legacy of Thrones. The guillotine is being sharpened as we speak. If you want a front row seat to the revolution, click subscribe and ring the bell. Do not lose your head because history is coming for it. Tell me in the comments below if you had to choose. Would you rather rule a dying empire like Franz Joseph, or lose your head at the peak of a party like the Bourbons? Until the next dynasty rises and rolls, goodbye.